The slap landed hard outside the diner door. Her head snapped aside. No one stepped out. No one spoke. Inside, people kept eating, eyes lowered, hearts racing, because in this town, silence was the price of survival. Then a retired Navy SEAL watched it all and chose the most dangerous response of all: restraint. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Winter settled over Helena, Montana, with a quiet authority, pressing snow into alleys and windowsills, while a roadside diner glowed weakly against the dark, its warmth fragile and conditional. Michael Hayes pushed the door open with the careful patience of someone who never entered a room without listening first. The bell rang once, thin and tired, then stopped. Heat met his face, carrying the smell of old coffee and grease that had learned how to linger. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, not fear, not readiness, but memory. Places like this had always been thresholds, before and after, inside and out. A woman's voice followed him in, urgent and controlled. Emily Dawson stood just inside the doorway, half turned toward a man in a leather jacket whose presence bent the air around him. She spoke quickly, quietly, her hands open in a gesture meant to de-escalate. "Outside," she said, not pleading, not commanding, negotiating. The man smiled with his mouth, but not his eyes. He liked being asked. He liked knowing he didn't have to listen. Michael looked past them and chose a booth near the window. He did not look back. He felt the weight of that decision settle between his shoulder blades like a stone he had learned to carry. His dog moved with him, a steady presence at his side, reading the room the way Michael did, by the absence of sound, by the way bodies angled away from trouble. They sat. The dog lay down without being told, close enough to feel but not to be seen. Michael rested his hands on the table and waited for his breathing to slow. He reminded himself that he was not here for anything but dinner. That was the lie he told himself, and it almost worked. When the waitress, another woman with tired eyes, came by, Michael ordered 2 hot meals, one for himself, one for the dog. He said it politely without explanation. She nodded and did not comment. No one did. In a town like this, questions were currency, and people learned early which ones cost too much. Outside, the wind rose. Emily's voice carried through the door in fragments, the way words do when they're meant to be heard, but not understood. Michael cut into his food with careful, economical motions. He tasted salt, heat, nothing else. He listened to the room, the scrape of a chair, a cough that stopped itself, the soft clink of a spoon placed down too carefully. Every patron was performing the same ritual. Don't look, don't react, don't be chosen. Michael recognized it. He had lived inside that silence once, long before uniforms and orders gave it a different name. The dog ate quietly. Michael felt the tension along the leash, not pulling, not straining, just alive. The animal's awareness moved outward, touching the door, the walls, the sudden gap in the room where sound should have been. Michael did not give a command. He didn't need to. They both knew the shape of restraint. They both knew its cost. The scream came suddenly, sharp enough to cut through the diner's stale air. It wasn't long. It didn't need to be. It was followed by a sound that Michael knew too well, the flat, unmistakable report of skin meeting, skin, not in passion or accident, but in ownership. The room reacted as one organism, heads dipped, shoulders rounded. A man near the counter closed his eyes as if counting. Someone whispered a prayer that didn't name God. Michael's fork paused halfway to his mouth. He felt the heat rise behind his eyes, the old reflex pushing forward like a tide. Images crowded in, faces, dust, the moment before impact when time stretches thin. He breathed. He let the fork rest back on the plate. He kept his gaze on the window, on the snow drifting sideways, indifferent to what it covered. He told himself that intervening now would be noise. That noise was what men like the one outside fed on. He told himself that there were ways to act that didn't look like action. He told himself that he was done being a hammer. Each thought landed and held, but none of them felt clean. The dog's body shifted, a subtle change in weight. Michael's foot pressed lightly against the dog's shoulder, a reminder, a promise. Stay, not yet. The dog accepted it, though everything in its posture spoke of readiness. Loyalty is not the absence of motion. It is motion held in check. No one stood. No one went to the door. The waitress did not come back. The cook stayed hidden. The room chose its shape and held it. Michael understood them. He resented them. He resented himself more. When Emily came back in, she moved like someone walking on ice that might crack. Her face was pale, her jaw set at an angle meant to keep her steady. She did not cry. She did not look at anyone. She wiped her hands on her apron, as if trying to erase the moment. The man in the leather jacket followed a step behind, grinning now, satisfied. He looked around, making sure the lesson had landed. It had. Their eyes met, his and Michael's. The man's gaze lingered, curious, assessing. Michael did not look away. He did not stare. He simply was. That, too, was a language. The man snorted and turned aside, his interest already fading. Michael felt the exchange settle somewhere deep and dangerous. Recognition without acknowledgement, a debt neither of them had named. Michael finished his meal. He paid at the counter, placing the money down neatly, as if order itself were a form of resistance. He did not speak to Emily, not yet. He did not trust his voice to stay where it belonged. The dog rose when he did, silent and close, a shadow that knew how to follow. As they stepped back into the cold, the wind slapped Michael's face hard enough to sting. He welcomed it. The snow swallowed their footprints almost immediately, erasing evidence of arrival, pretending no one had crossed the threshold at all. Michael stood there for a moment longer than necessary, listening to the diner behind him resume its careful breathing. He knew what he had chosen by sitting down and eating. He knew what he had delayed by doing so, the weight of it pressed against his ribs. He told himself that patience was not cowardice. He told himself that timing mattered. He told himself that winter did not end in one night. Somewhere inside, a line had been drawn, not in anger, not in heroics, but in the quiet place where endurance turns into resolve. The dog leaned briefly against his leg, grounding him. Michael rested a hand on the dog's neck and felt the steady pulse beneath. They walked away together, the diner's light shrinking behind them, carrying with them the knowledge that silence, once noticed, never sounds the same again. Winter wind scraped Helena's streets clean, pushing powdery snow into corners and under doors, while the diner's neon kept flickering like a weak heartbeat that refused to quit. Michael Hayes could have kept walking, and for 3 steps he did, letting the cold slap his cheeks and pretending the sting was enough to wash the moment away. But the sound behind him was not a sound that belonged to weather. It was a voice breaking, the kind of break that doesn't mend on its own, and something inside him tightened the way it used to tighten when radios went quiet and the wrong silence settled over a team. The German shepherd at his side matched his pause without being told, not because it needed instructions, but because it knew him in the private language built from nights when sleep didn't come and mornings when guilt did. Michael told himself he had already made his choice back at the booth, that he had paid his bill, that he had walked out, that restraint was a discipline, and discipline was what kept people alive, yet his mind kept replaying the sound of that slap, not as a single act, but as a claim, a declaration that a human being could be corrected like a mistake, and the world would accept it. He turned before he could debate himself into numbness. The doorbell gave its thin jingle again as he stepped back inside, and the room's eyes moved in quick, frightened increments, like small animals tracking a shadow. The biker was still there, still basking in the heat of control, still wearing the same smile that said the town belonged to him. Emily Dawson stood behind the counter with her hands braced on the edge as if holding herself upright took all her strength. She did not look at Michael, but her breath hitched in a way he noticed anyway, and he hated that he noticed because noticing created responsibility. Michael walked past the booths and stopped at the biker's shoulder. The man turned slowly, enjoying the moment before conflict, the way predators savor the turn of prey. Michael's voice came out calm, almost polite, and that calm did not feel like virtue. It felt like an old tool pulled from a drawer he'd hoped to keep shut. "You're done," he said, not shouted, not performed, just placed into the air like a line on a map. The biker laughed, loud enough to remind the room who he expected them to fear. He leaned closer, letting his breath carry the message that he didn't need permission to invade space, and Michael felt his own pulse rise, not in panic, but in the familiar readiness that once meant he had brothers behind him, and rules that made sense. Here, he had only the dog and his own judgment, and judgment could be heavier than any pack. The biker lifted a hand as if to tap Michael's cheek the way he'd tapped Emily's, and that was the moment Michael stopped thinking in words. He moved, not fast for spectacle, but fast because efficiency had been drilled into him until it became muscle memory. He caught the wrist, turned the arm, shifted his weight, and the biker's laugh collapsed into a startled grunt as his balance vanished. The German shepherd rose, silent and rigid, with contained purpose, not lunging, not snarling, but present in a way that changed the shape of the room, like a door quietly locking. Michael felt the dog's restraint as a mirror of his own. Both of them were holding back storms for the sake of one clear result. The biker thrashed and swore, trying to make noise into power again, but Michael kept his voice low, commanding without cruelty. "Stop," he said, and he meant it as much for himself as for the man. Chairs scraped. Someone whispered, "Don't." Not to the biker, but to Michael. A middle-aged man from a booth stood halfway, then sat again, like gravity had doubled. He reached out and caught Michael's sleeve with shaking fingers, eyes wide with the helpless knowledge of how this town punished courage. "Please," the man murmured, barely sound, "don't go looking for trouble. He's not alone. You don't understand what you're stepping into." Michael understood more than the man guessed, and that made it worse because understanding meant he could no longer claim ignorance as an excuse. He looked at the man's hand on his sleeve and thought of a different hand, years ago, gripping his arm before a door was kicked, and how that grip had been trust. This grip was fear. Michael eased the hand away gently, a small mercy in a room starving for any. "I do understand," he said, and the words tasted like iron. "That's why I'm not looking away." He brought the biker to his feet and guided him out into the cold, keeping the man's arm pinned just enough to prevent another swing, but not enough to break, because this wasn't vengeance, and Michael refused to let it become that. The German shepherd walked tight at his leg, eyes tracking every angle, every car, every distant movement, carrying the weight of loyalty without needing to display it. The biker spat threats that sounded rehearsed, names hinted at but not spoken. The kind of threats that lived off rumors and the town's willingness to believe them. Michael ignored the words and focused on action, on distance, on getting the problem into light, where witnesses existed, because darkness was where bullies became gods. He marched the biker down the street toward the precinct, snow crunching under boots, the air turning every breath into a white confession. With each step, Michael felt the old internal argument grinding, stand down to survive or stand firm to remain yourself. He had survived plenty. The question that haunted him now was whether survival without self-respect was just another form of defeat. The station sat squat and plain, a building that should have represented order but felt like a sealed mouth. Inside, fluorescent light flattened everyone's faces into tired masks. The front desk officer looked up, saw the biker, and his posture changed instantly, the way a body changes when it recognizes a rule that isn't written on paper. Two other officers nearby went still, eyes dropping to keyboards, to paperwork, to anything but what was in front of them. The silence in that room was not neutrality, it was complicity trained by consequence. Michael pushed the biker toward the desk. "Assault," he said simply, and nodded back toward the diner. "Outside, in public." The desk officer swallowed and didn't ask for details, didn't ask for statements, didn't ask for Emily. His gaze flicked to the biker as if seeking permission to do his job, and the biker's grin returned, slow and smug, a grin that said he'd been here before and the ending was always the same. Michael felt anger flare, quick and hot, but underneath it was something colder, the dread of realizing the system was not broken by accident. The German shepherd sat close at Michael's heel, alert in a way that felt like a hand on Michael's spine, steadying him, reminding him that whatever came next, he was not alone. Footsteps sounded from a hallway, measured, confident, and the room's tension snapped tighter. The police chief appeared, a man whose badge looked heavy with ownership rather than service. He took in the biker first, then Michael, then the dog, and Michael felt the chief's attention linger on him with the practiced assessment of someone who had decided long ago which truths mattered. The chief's voice was smooth, almost bored. "What's this?" Michael explained again, careful, factual, leaving no room for drama to be twisted. The chief listened with an expression that suggested Michael was telling a story he had already heard and already dismissed. Then the chief turned his head slightly and said the biker's name as if greeting a colleague, and the answer to the whole town's silence clicked into place in Michael's mind, like a lock closing. The biker chuckled. "Told you," the biker said softly, as if they were sharing a joke. Michael waited for procedure, for handcuffs on the right wrists, for paperwork, for something that resembled law. Instead, the chief's eyes narrowed at Michael with mild annoyance, the way a man looks at a spill that needs cleaning. "You laid hands on him," the chief said. "In my jurisdiction." Michael's stomach sank, not from surprise, but from the bitter clarity of confirmation. "I stopped an assault," Michael replied, and he heard his own restraint thinning at the edges. The chief stepped closer, lowering his voice, turning the moment into an intimate threat. "You came into my town and started trouble," he said. "We don't need drifters playing hero." The word hero was spoken like an insult. An officer moved behind Michael. Another approached the dog with hesitation and then stopped, as if afraid the animal could smell fear as easily as Michael could. Michael held his hands visible, palms open, refusing to give them the picture they wanted. But the chief had already chosen the narrative that protected the money in the shadows. "Disorderly conduct," the chief announced, louder now, for the room, for the record that would be written later. "Assault." The words fell like snow, quiet, accumulating, smothering. Michael felt the cuff bite his wrists and a wave of old fury surge up, the kind that used to be redirected into mission, into targets, into clarity, but here it had nowhere clean to go. The German shepherd whined once, low and controlled, a sound that wasn't panic but protest, and Michael turned his head just enough to meet the dog's eyes. He breathed in, slow. He breathed out. "Stay," he said softly. And the dog obeyed, not because it didn't want to fight, but because it trusted Michael more than its own instincts. That trust landed in Michael's chest, like both comfort and accusation. They led him down a hallway that smelled of bleach and resignation, and Michael understood the shape of the trap. The town would watch him get punished for intervening, and the next person would learn the lesson faster. In the holding area, metal benches waited under cold light, and when the cell door shut, the sound was final in a way the winter wind had never been. The German shepherd was brought in, too, confined not with cruelty, but with the casual indifference of men who didn't understand what it meant to separate a soldier from his last steady anchor. Michael sat, wrists aching, mind sharper than it wanted to be. He thought of Emily behind the counter, of the guests who looked away, of the man who begged him not to make trouble, and he realized that trouble had already been here long before he arrived. He had simply refused to call it normal. Somewhere beyond the wall, the chief's voice drifted faintly, speaking to someone with a tone that sounded too familiar to be official. Michael leaned his forehead forward until it hovered just above his clasped hands, and in that small posture, he made himself one promise. He would not let his arrest become the end of the story. The German shepherd settled close, breathing steady, pressing warmth into the cold space, and Michael felt the dog's presence like a silent oath that endurance could become leverage. As the station quieted into late-night routine, a new set of footsteps paused outside the cell block, hesitant, then closer, and a young voice asked a guard a question that sounded like it didn't belong to the same corrupt script, and Michael lifted his head, listening. The holding area smelled of disinfectant and old metal, a place where time slowed into something thick and deliberate, measured by the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant click of doors opening for other people's mistakes. Michael Hayes sat with his back straight against the cold wall, wrists free now, but marked by memory more than pressure, and let his breathing settle into a rhythm he trusted. He had learned long ago that panic wasted oxygen and anger wasted clarity. The German shepherd lay close beside him, not touching, not demanding, simply present in the way only something loyal without conditions could be. The dog's thoughts were not complicated, but they were deep. Danger had shifted shape, not ended. The pack was smaller now, but still intact. Waiting was not surrender. Michael felt that calm certainty press against his own fraying edge and took it as permission to keep thinking instead of reacting. Footsteps approached again, lighter than the chief's, unsure of their right to be heard. A young man appeared beyond the bars, hesitating as if each step closer might change his life in ways he could not yet measure. His uniform was new enough to still believe in itself. His eyes, however, had already begun to learn disappointment. He glanced once at the guard down the hall, then back at Michael, and lowered his voice. "You shouldn't be here," he said, not as an accusation, but as an admission. Michael studied him without speaking, recognizing the look of someone standing at the edge of a choice that would not offer a safe middle. The young officer introduced himself as Daniel Reed, and the name carried no weight yet, no reputation, just a person attached to it, and Michael respected that more than he would have respected bravado. Daniel shifted his stance, clearly rehearsing this conversation in his head while fearing it at the same time. He told Michael that what happened at the diner was not an anomaly, that the biker was not just muscle, but a messenger, a collector for a man whose reach extended well beyond leather jackets and loud engines. Daniel did not say the boss's name at first, as if speaking it aloud might summon consequences faster than he could outrun them. He spoke instead of patterns, complaints that disappeared, reports rewritten, cameras that failed at convenient moments, officers who transferred suddenly or stopped asking questions. He spoke of the police chief not as a villain, but as something more frightening, a man who had decided long ago which side of the line paid better and slept easier. Michael listened and felt the shape of the problem crystallize into something solid and familiar. Corruption was not chaos. It was a system. Systems could be mapped. The thought steadied him even as it darkened the horizon. Daniel glanced at the dog, then back at Michael, and confessed that he had watched the diner footage already, that he had seen enough to know Michael had stopped a crime, not caused one, and that knowing had lodged in his chest like a stone he could not dislodge. He admitted his fear without ceremony, explaining that everyone in town knew what happened to people who challenged the arrangement, how livelihoods vanished, how accidents multiplied, how silence became a survival skill taught as early as reading. Michael felt an old bitterness surface, not toward Daniel, but toward the machinery that put men like him in impossible positions and called it order. He told Daniel he did not expect heroics, did not need speeches about right and wrong. He asked instead a quieter question. Do you want this to be the rest of your life? Daniel swallowed, and in that moment, Michael saw the past flicker behind the young man's eyes, some father or teacher who had spoken about duty as if it were clean and simple. Daniel said he didn't know how to fight something this big. Michael nodded. He understood that too. He told Daniel that fighting was rarely the first step. Seeing clearly was. Documentation mattered. Witnesses mattered. Time mattered. He said nothing about plans, nothing about allies, nothing that could be used against Daniel if fear won later. He offered only this: if Daniel chose to remember what he had seen, truly remember it, that memory would matter when the moment came. Silence settled between them, heavy but not hostile. The German shepherd shifted closer to Michael, its calm attention focused outward, sensing tension, but trusting Michael's stillness. Daniel took a breath that sounded like relief and terror mixed together. He said he would see what he could do, which was not a promise, but it was more than nothing. And in places like this, more than nothing was how change began. When Daniel left, his footsteps retreated quickly, as if he needed distance to keep his courage from evaporating. The hours that followed dragged themselves across the floor. Michael replayed the diner in his mind, not the slap itself, but the way the room had folded inward, the way fear had organized itself into obedience. He thought of Emily, of her careful voice and steadier spine, and wondered how many times she had negotiated her own safety with men who enjoyed the ritual. He wondered how many people in this town carried similar ledgers of quiet humiliation. The dog's presence anchored him when his thoughts threatened to spiral into rage. The animal did not hate the biker, did not resent the chief. It understood threat and protection, pack and boundary. Michael envied that clarity even as he relied on it. Eventually, a guard returned and announced that Michael would be released in the morning, that there were no charges that would stick, that it would be better for everyone if Michael left town and forgot what he had seen. The guard spoke the words like advice, not warning, and Michael understood that this too was part of the system. Exile without paperwork, compliance without confession. Alone again, Michael leaned back and closed his eyes. He did not sleep. He measured the room by sound and shadow, by the steady breathing of the dog, by the memory of Daniel's conflicted gaze. He knew now that the problem was larger than one biker and more dangerous than one corrupt official. He also knew that fear thrived on isolation, and isolation was already cracking. Somewhere beyond these walls, a young officer wrestled with the weight of knowledge. Somewhere else, a waitress wiped down a counter that had seen too much. Michael felt resolve settle where anger had burned earlier, slower but stronger, like ice forming under pressure. When morning came, he would walk out into the same cold streets, and nothing would look different to anyone watching. That, he understood, was exactly how the next move needed to begin. Morning arrived without ceremony, a pale winter light spreading over Helena as if unsure it was welcome, softening the edges of buildings but not their intent. Michael Hayes stepped out of the station with the German shepherd at his side, the cold biting harder than it had the night before, or maybe he simply felt it more now that the walls were gone. Freedom tasted thin. It always did after confinement, especially when it came wrapped in a suggestion rather than an apology. The guard's parting words still echoed in his head, the polite recommendation that he leave town and let things settle back into their familiar shape. Michael understood that language well enough to know it meant disappear. He walked anyway, boots crunching on snow that had already begun to erase last night's tracks, the dog moving beside him with a quiet attentiveness that felt like both comfort and question. The city looked unchanged in daylight, which was the cruelest trick of all, because it meant violence could hide in plain sight and call itself routine. Michael told himself he would get back to the small rental on the edge of town, pack what little he owned, and think. He told himself that thinking was still an option. He had gone barely 2 blocks when he saw her. Emily Dawson sat on the low concrete steps outside a closed storefront, shoulders hunched, coat pulled tight, but failing to keep the cold or the weight of the night away. Her face was turned down, hair falling forward like a curtain she hoped might block the world, and the sound she made was not loud enough to draw attention, which somehow made it worse. Michael slowed without deciding to. He had learned that some moments chose you before you chose them. The German shepherd noticed her too, not with alarm, but with the quiet recognition of distress, ears angling forward, body steady, waiting for Michael's lead. Michael stopped a few feet away, giving her space because space mattered when someone felt cornered by circumstance. He said her name once, softly, testing whether it would break something fragile. Emily looked up, startled, then ashamed of being startled, and wiped her face with the heel of her hand, as if erasing evidence might undo consequence. She tried to smile and failed, and the failure told Michael more than any words could have. She spoke in fragments at first, sentences breaking apart under their own weight. The diner owner had let her go that morning, she said, not unkindly, not angrily, but firmly, the way people do when fear has made a decision for them. He couldn't afford trouble. He couldn't protect her. He hoped she understood. Michael did understand, and that understanding did nothing to ease the tightness in his chest. Emily went on, the words coming faster now, like a dam cracking. The landlord had posted a notice. Back rent she hadn't known she was behind on had suddenly become urgent. By tomorrow, she and her mother would need to be gone. She laughed once, short and brittle, at the absurdity of timing, how quickly a life could unravel when the wrong man decided to remind you of your place. Michael listened without interrupting, because interruption would have turned this into advice, and advice was a luxury she had not asked for. He thought of the holding cell, of Daniel Reed's conflicted eyes, of the guard's careful warning, and he felt the weight of a choice settle again, heavier this time, because it involved someone else's survival. The German shepherd stepped closer to Emily, not touching, simply existing in her line of sight, and Emily's gaze dropped to the dog, lingering there as if the animal's steady presence offered a shape her own thoughts lacked. Michael watched that exchange and recognized something ancient and simple passing between them, acknowledgement without judgment. Emily asked him what he was going to do now, the question carrying more concern for him than for herself, and that generosity, misplaced as it was, undid the last of his hesitation. He told her he had a place, small and unremarkable, but warm enough, and that she and her mother could stay as long as they needed. He did not dress it up as charity or heroism. He said it plainly because plain truth was harder to refuse and easier to trust. Emily stared at him, suspicion flickering behind gratitude, the look of someone who had learned that help often came with conditions. She asked why, and Michael answered honestly that he could not walk away from what he had seen, that leaving town without addressing the damage left behind would not make him safer, only emptier. He did not mention plans or confrontations or the web of corruption Daniel had outlined. He spoke only of shelter and time, because those were the currencies she needed most. Emily's shoulders sagged, the fight leaking out of her in a way that looked almost like relief, and she nodded once, as if accepting a truth she had already known but feared to claim. The walk to Michael's place was quiet, the city unfolding around them in muted winter colors. Emily talked about her mother then, about illness that came and went, about how the diner job had been the thin line holding everything together. Michael listened and filed the information away, not as strategy, but as responsibility. The German shepherd walked between them at times, adjusting pace without instruction, sensitive to the subtle shifts in their steps, a living bridge when words ran out. Michael's rental sat back from the road, a modest structure that bore no signs of ambition or permanence. Inside, the heat hummed unevenly, but it hummed, and that felt like a promise. Emily's mother was awake when they arrived, eyes wary but sharp, taking in Michael and the dog with a gaze honed by years of measuring risk. Michael introduced himself simply and explained the arrangement without embellishment. The older woman listened, then nodded, the decision settling in her bones with a practicality that came from knowing when pride needed to bend. As Emily busied herself making tea with hands that still trembled slightly, Michael stood by the window and watched the snow fall again, thicker now, the city blurring at the edges. He felt the shape of the coming conflict press closer, not as dread, but as inevitability. Offering shelter had not been part of any plan he might have formed in the holding cell, but he recognized it now as a necessary first move. Protection was not only about stopping fists or breaking systems, it was about creating spaces where fear could loosen its grip long enough for people to breathe. The German shepherd settled near the door, alert but calm, a quiet sentinel, marking this place as part of its pack now. Michael rested a hand briefly on the dog's head, drawing strength from the simple certainty there, and understood that by opening his door he had drawn a line that would be noticed. Outside, a car passed slowly, tires hissing on slush, and Michael wondered who was watching, who would report what they had seen, and how long it would take for curiosity to turn into threat. He did not regret the choice. Regret belonged to paths not taken, and this path, difficult as it promised to be, felt aligned with the man he still wanted to recognize when he looked in the mirror. As the kettle whistled and Emily's voice softened into something like normal conversation, Michael allowed himself one steadying breath. Tomorrow would bring consequences. Tonight, he had given 2 people a roof and himself a reason to stay. Evening returned to Helena with the same deceptive calm as before, snow drifting down in lazy spirals that made the town look gentler than it was, the diner's neon light once again flickering against the dark like a dare. Michael Hayes arrived early this time, not to hide, but to watch, to let the rhythm of the place settle into him. He took the same booth by the window, not out of habit, but intention, and ordered the same food, 2 portions, one for himself and one for the German shepherd, because repetition had a way of making people careless. The dog lay at his feet, alert without tension, aware that something had shifted since the last visit. This was not avoidance, this was return. Michael felt the weight of the room differently now, not as a threat pressing inward, but as a field of lines waiting to be crossed. He thought briefly of Emily and her mother back at the house, of the kettle steaming on the stove, of the fragile sense of safety that could shatter if he misjudged this night. The thought sharpened him rather than slowed him. He had not come to provoke. He had come to finish something that had already begun. The diners filled gradually, faces familiar, fear familiar too, but threaded now with curiosity. They recognized him. They remembered the arrest. Silence thickened, but it was not as absolute as before. When the biker arrived, he did so with performance, boots loud, laugh louder, swagger polished by the knowledge that he had walked away clean last time. He did not come for money tonight. He came to remind Michael Hayes and everyone watching of the hierarchy that governed this town. He spotted Michael immediately and smiled with theatrical delight, the smile of a man who believed the story had already been written. He made a show of approaching the booth, leaning close enough to invade space again, his voice dripping with mock concern. He spoke about jail, about lessons, about knowing one's place. Michael listened without responding, his attention split between the biker's words and the subtle movements of the room, the way shoulders tensed, the way eyes darted toward the door. The biker laughed again, and as if on cue, turned his cruelty sideways, directing it where he thought it would hurt most. He nudged the German shepherd with his boot, not hard enough to draw blood, but hard enough to assert dominance, to test reaction. The room held its breath. The dog stiffened, every instinct surging forward, the memory of restraint battling the command to protect. Michael felt the leash of his own control stretch thin, felt anger rise hot and bright. But he did not shout. He did not lunge. He spoke one quiet word, meant only for the dog, and the animal obeyed, holding itself in check with a discipline that turned the biker's grin uncertain. Michael stood then, slowly, deliberately, letting the movement draw attention without inviting chaos. He met the biker's eyes and, for the first time, allowed the man to see something unhidden there. Not rage, not fear. Resolve. He told the biker to leave, his voice calm enough to sound like certainty rather than challenge. The biker scoffed, playing to the room, but Michael could see the calculation begin behind his eyes, the realization that this was not the same man he had laughed off before. What the biker did not know, what he could not know, was that every word he had spoken, every step he had taken, every casual act of intimidation had been quietly recorded. Cameras outside. A phone left deliberately on the counter by a patron who had decided that fear was no longer enough. Witnesses who had been primed not with speeches, but with the simple knowledge that someone would stand with them if they spoke. When the biker shoved Michael, expecting resistance to justify escalation, Michael moved with decisive precision. He redirected the force, controlled the fall, and brought the biker down without spectacle, pinning him just long enough to make the lesson unmistakable. This was not vengeance. It was containment. The German Shepherd rose, positioning itself as a barrier rather than a weapon, a silent declaration that the line had been crossed and would not be crossed again tonight. Michael leaned close to the biker, his voice low enough that only the man beneath him could hear. He spoke not of threats, but of consequences, of attention drawn, of games ending when light reached them. He told him to pass a message to his boss, not dramatic, not angry, simply factual. Helena was no longer quiet. The biker's bravado cracked just enough to be seen, and Michael released him, stepping back before the moment could sour into something else. The room exhaled. No one cheered, no one clapped. But no one looked away either. The biker staggered to his feet, humiliation burning brighter than pain, and stormed out, his exit loud and unfinished. Michael sat back down, heart still racing, hands steady now. He paid his bill again because order mattered, because endings should be clean even when beginnings were not. As he stood to leave, he felt eyes on him, not pleading this time, but questioning, measuring, and he knew that whatever followed would not remain contained within diner walls. Outside, the cold wrapped around him like a warning. The German Shepherd walked close, tension easing, but awareness intact. Michael looked once at the neon sign flickering against the snow and understood that the challenge he had issued would be answered. The town would not be able to pretend much longer. As they headed back toward the house, Michael felt the shape of approaching danger solidify, not as fear, but as preparation, and he knew that tonight had turned a corner that could not be turned back. Snow thickened overnight, muffling Helena, beneath a white hush that turned streets into corridors and houses into silhouettes, while Michael Hayes stood awake before dawn, listening to a town hold its breath. He had not slept much. He had sat at the small kitchen table with a cup gone cold, the German Shepherd resting nearby, both of them attuned to the same quiet signals that precede impact. This was not anxiety, it was alignment. Michael felt the difference in his body, the way thought narrowed into preparation, the way doubt stepped aside to make room for sequence and timing. He had lived inside moments like this before, when anticipation was not fear but math, when survival depended on assuming the worst and shaping the response before the first blow landed. Emily and her mother slept in the back room, the fragile normalcy of that fact pressing on him harder than any threat. He had invited consequence into his life the moment he brought them through the door, and now consequence was answering. The dog lifted its head at a distant sound, not loud enough to register as danger yet, but distinct enough to mark as movement that did not belong. Michael rose, checked the window without parting the curtain, and saw headlights where there should not have been any, pairs of them, then more, moving slowly, deliberately, like a parade that did not care who noticed. The message was unmistakable. The biker had delivered his humiliation upward, and the response was coming in force. Michael did not rush. He moved through the house with controlled efficiency, securing doors, guiding Emily and her mother into the safest interior space he had already chosen the night before, explaining only what they needed to know. Stay quiet, stay put, trust him. Emily's eyes searched his face for reassurance, and he gave her the only honest version he had, steady but unadorned. "I've planned for this," he said, and let the weight of that planning speak for him. Outside, engines cut one by one, an intentional silence replacing the earlier growl. Shapes moved beyond the snow, numbers resolving themselves into a count Michael could not ignore. There were many of them, more than bravado, more than intimidation. There were enough to make a statement. The German shepherd paced once, then settled, sensing the shift from waiting to execution, the moment when loyalty became placement rather than motion. Michael felt the familiar narrowing of focus, the way the world reduced itself to angles, cover, lines of sight. He checked his phone, saw the unread message from a number he recognized, short and precise, confirmation without flourish. Help was closer than it appeared. That knowledge did not relax him, it clarified him. The first biker approached the porch, boots heavy, confidence inflated by numbers, and called Michael out by name as if they were old friends. The voice carried threat, wrapped in mock courtesy, the promise of punishment, disguised as negotiation. Michael did not answer. Silence, he knew, could force men to reveal themselves faster than confrontation. The porch creaked under weight, wood complaining as pressure increased. A window shattered on the far side of the house, glass exploding inward, the sound sharp and final. Emily gasped behind him, and Michael raised a hand without looking back, a small gesture that meant stay with me, even when you cannot see me. He moved, using the house the way he had mapped it, redirecting attention, controlling flow, refusing to give the attackers the center they wanted. The German shepherd followed his cues flawlessly, not attacking, not retreating, positioning itself to guard the space that mattered most. Outside, shouts rose, frustration replacing swagger, as their assumption of easy dominance began to erode. Michael heard the shift and recognized it as opportunity. He spoke then, not loudly, but clearly, his voice carrying through the broken window and the open door. He named what was happening, stripped it of drama, told them they were being recorded, that witnesses were already moving, that the line they were crossing would not be erased by money or silence. Laughter answered him at first, the brittle laughter of men who had never been forced to imagine consequence, but it faltered as lights appeared at the edge of the street, not one set, but several, moving with purpose rather than curiosity. The German shepherd's attention locked onto the change, body taut, ready to transition if needed. Michael felt the moment pivot. Radios crackled. Commands cut through the noise, sharp and unmistakable. The bikers hesitated, the group's cohesion thinning, as the truth of being outmaneuvered seeped in. Vehicles marked and unmarked slid into place, hemming the scene without spectacle, precision replacing chaos. Michael recognized the posture of professionals when he saw it, the way they claimed space without theatrics. A man stepped forward from the arriving units, authority worn lightly, eyes scanning the situation with practiced calm. He spoke the words Michael had been waiting to hear, identifying federal jurisdiction, naming charges that did not rely on local goodwill. The bikers' anger spiked into panic, some backing away, others posturing uselessly, but the center of gravity had shifted, and they felt it. Michael remained where he was, hands visible, presence steady, allowing the larger machine to engage now that it had arrived. He did not need to prove anything further. The German Shepherd stayed close, a quiet constant, amid the rising clatter of handcuffs and shouted orders. Somewhere in the confusion, a familiar figure was pulled from the group, a man whose confidence had fueled the town's fear for years, now stripped of distance and mythology, reduced to a body resisting gravity. Michael watched without satisfaction, without pity, understanding that this was not an ending, but an exposure. As the last of the bikers were secured and the street settled into a stunned stillness, Michael felt the adrenaline drain, leaving behind the ache of having held too much for too long. He went back inside, checked on Emily and her mother, accepted their relief without accepting praise. Outside, snow continued to fall, already covering the scars of the confrontation, pretending nothing had happened. Michael knew better. He also knew that power rarely surrendered quietly, that this capture would provoke counter-stories, denials, threats whispered from safe distances. As the authorities moved to clear the scene, one of them paused near Michael, meeting his eyes with a look that acknowledged shared understanding without needing explanation. "This isn't over," the man said, not as warning, but as fact. Michael nodded. He had never expected it to be. He closed the door, leaned his forehead briefly against the cool wood, and listened to the German Shepherd's steady breathing behind him. The pack was safe for now. The storm, however, had only changed shape. Snow fell softly over Helena at dawn, smoothing the streets into something almost gentle, as if the town itself were trying to forget how loudly it had screamed the night before. Michael Hayes stood near the window of the small house and watched the light change, not searching for threats anymore, but measuring what remained when the noise faded. The German Shepherd lay nearby, awake but resting, its thoughts no longer fixed on angles of attack or escape routes, instead tuned to a quieter truth the animal understood better than most people. Danger had passed, but vigilance was now habit, not urgency. The hours after the arrests moved strangely, neither fast nor slow, filled with procedural footsteps, careful conversations, and the heavy presence of consequence settling into place. Federal agents returned more than once, their questions precise and unadorned, interested not in drama, but in continuity, in patterns that could withstand scrutiny. Michael answered what he knew and refused what he did not, grounding himself in facts the way he once grounded himself in coordinates. He felt no triumph as the name of the crime boss surfaced repeatedly in those conversations, stripped of rumor and reshaped into charges that could no longer be laughed off. Power, he had learned, often survived on distance. Once dragged into light and named properly, it shrank into something manageable. Emily Dawson sat at the kitchen table with her mother, listening when asked, speaking when necessary, her voice steadier than it had been days earlier, steadier because it was finally being heard without punishment. She spoke of the diner, of threats disguised as jokes, of money demanded and silence expected, and each sentence felt like setting down a weight she had carried alone for too long. Her mother added what she could, smaller details, remembered dates, names half forgotten but written down somewhere safe, proof that endurance could become evidence if given time. Michael watched them and understood that this was the true turning point, not the arrest itself, but the moment when fear lost its monopoly on the future. Later that day, Daniel Reed arrived quietly, no longer sneaking through hallways, but still careful, because courage did not erase risk. He carried a small drive in his pocket and the look of someone who had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He told Michael that the chief had tried to dismiss the situation, to frame the night as an overreaction. But the files Daniel had preserved told a different story, one that matched too many accounts to be buried again. Daniel spoke with relief, edged by exhaustion, admitting that keeping the evidence had cost him sleep and nearly cost him his nerve, but that seeing the bikers led away in cuffs had steadied something inside him. Michael thanked him without ceremony, because praise could feel dangerous when trust was still new, and because Daniel had not done this for recognition. He had done it so he could live with himself. The German shepherd lifted its head briefly at Daniel's presence, recognized familiarity without threat, then settled again, content to let the humans handle what words were finally capable of handling. News traveled quickly through Helena, faster than snow could fall, and by afternoon the town felt altered in subtle ways. People stood a little straighter at the gas station, spoke a little louder in line, met each other's eyes without the reflexive glance over the shoulder. The diner reopened under new management within days, not because courage had suddenly become fashionable, but because survival no longer required complicity. Emily found work there again, not out of obligation but choice, her role different now, her presence a reminder that harm did not have to define a place forever. The former police chief was suspended, then arrested, his private arrangements exposed by documents that no longer had a safe drawer to hide in. Michael followed the developments from a distance, not inserting himself into interviews or statements, understanding that systems corrected best when individuals stepped aside once their part was done. He had never wanted to be the center of this story, and now that it was ending, he felt a familiar pull to move on, before gratitude hardened into expectation. On his last morning in town, Michael packed quietly while Emily's mother insisted on making breakfast, a simple meal that felt ceremonial in its ordinariness. They spoke of small plans, of doctor's appointments and job interviews, of futures that were suddenly thinkable again, and Michael listened with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had helped shift a burden without needing to carry it forever. When it was time to leave, Emily walked him to the door and struggled for words, then settled for honesty, telling him that he had reminded her what standing still could look like, how restraint could be its own form of defiance. Michael nodded, accepting the sentiment without letting it anchor him. Outside, the German shepherd paused, taking in the street one last time, then looked to Michael, ready to follow wherever the next road led. They drove out of Helena as the snow began again, light and patient, covering tracks without erasing memory. Michael did not look back, not because he was fleeing, but because he trusted that what had changed would hold. He carried no illusions about justice being permanent or easy, only the quieter faith that moments of clarity mattered, that people who chose to speak when it was costly shifted the balance more than they realized. The German shepherd rested its head against the seat, content in motion, bound not to places, but to purpose. As the town disappeared behind a curtain of white, Michael felt the story close, not with a victory shout, but with a steady exhale, the kind that comes when a line has been crossed and not retreated from, when silence has been broken carefully, and the echo left behind is strong enough to last. Sometimes we wait for miracles to arrive with thunder, with power, with a sudden force that cannot be ignored, but this story reminds us that God often works in quieter ways, through restraint instead of rage, through courage that does not announce itself, and through ordinary people who choose to stand firm when it would be easier to look away. In our daily lives, we face moments like this more often than we realize, moments when staying silent feels safer, when speaking up feels costly, and when walking away seems like the only way to survive. Yet it is in those moments that faith is tested and character is revealed. Scripture teaches us that the truth sets us free, not always quickly and not without sacrifice, but inevitably, and that God does not abandon those who choose what is right, even when the path is lonely. If this story touched your heart, let it remind you that your quiet integrity matters, that your voice has weight, and that even small acts of courage can become part of something greater than you can see. Please share this story with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment to let others know they are not alone, and subscribe to this channel so more stories of faith, strength, and redemption can be told. May God bless you, protect you, and walk beside you in every silent battle you face. And may His peace remain with you and your loved ones always.